Okay, so here we are. Welcome to Dive into World Building. Yay! First, an announcement. Next week, we're going to have a special guest. Author Jen Brissett is going to be here talking about her book called Elysium, and that's going to be really, really neat. So everybody come. It'll be awesome. And great. This week's topic is place names in geography. And I'm not sure how much time we're going to spend on place names and how much on geography, but at least we have places to go, literally or figuratively. I think a lot of the same issues, as far as putting place names together is concerned, a lot of the same issues come in as we were dealing with last week when we were talking about character names, though obviously it's less likely that you're going to be using a place name that you've actually heard before in a fictional world. I'm not sure. Do you guys want to get into the question of when we set our work in an actual place?
Why? I mean, why not? You know.
Because you know, my brain is always going to secondary worlds and alien planets, and but I mean, actual physical environments can be almost like characters in a story.
Right.
So, I mean, that can be really valuable.
You know, haunted. There's something that's a little bit relevant in that, in a weird interstitial kind of way, and that you know, it's obviously a small town in Pennsylvania, but I intentionally never named the town. I just give it kind of markers that would make you like sort of be able to identify it as a place in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
But I very specifically left out the place name because there are certain qualities about Pennsylvania small towns that I think if you are a resident of Pennsylvania, you will recognize as kind of your own.
Yeah.
So that was a very intentional thing. Whether that works well for the reader or not, because you know, my notion of that was to allow for more reader immersion in the place without, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Without saying, "Oh, that's somebody else's town."
Right.
That's an interesting issue too.
Yeah, because sometimes if you have an idea of a place and it doesn't match up with your experience when it's used in fiction, I think that that can cause a little bit of a disconnect from the narrative for the reader's experience. I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think that you can have books like Interview with a Vampire, which is set specifically in New Orleans, and there's a ton of research there, and there's a ton of setting there, and there's a ton of all kinds of stuff there. Or you can do things like in an unknown town in Maine.
Oh my God!
Right? So there's that. I mean, so for example, I have a book set in an unknown university town in California.
Nice.
And what I did was I actually kind of just made up the university, but I gave it features that would be evocative of, alternately, Berkeley and Stanford. You know, so that anybody who had actually been to Berkeley or Stanford would know that it was neither one of these, but that aspects of their experience would sort of seep into this environment. Yeah, so that was sort of a hybrid location.
Yeah.
And I can't recall if I ever used the name of the town, and I think I didn't. Because that would have been that. See, if you use the name of a town, that sends people to a map.
Yeah.
See, I like fictional towns with names. I have that. I have a fictional town in Maine, um, which it's in my novel Tea Times 3, and I ended up like I named the town Midswich because originally I had wanted to set the whole thing in England because I wanted it to be like this little small town British comedy, which I love so much. Um, and then like a friend of mine was just like, just put it in America, and I'm like, oh my God, you're brilliant. But I wanted it to like it's sort of the town's claim to fame is being this kitschy British village that people go to because it looks like a British village. So it's very much like a tourist town. So it still has like the British name and all the street names are Britishy. But it's basically it's kind of a tourist trap like Solvang.
Okay.
California with the Swedish town. So it's kind of like that, but in Maine, and just to indulge my love of England.
It changes your accountability, doesn't it?
Yes.
You can just make stuff.
Can I ask why you chose the name Midwich?
Because it sounded good, and it seems somewhat Britishly, but non-specific. I know.
I take it you're not familiar with the book The Midwich Cuckoos.
Oh my God, no! I have not ever heard of that.
Okay, it's been filmed a couple of times. Village of the Damned was based on it. It's a book in which the village is the site of an alien implantation. So I just wondered if you were aware of that at all.
I saw the movie. I've seen Village of the Damned and then the American remake of the Village of the Damned.
Yep.
There
you go. That's Midwich.
Yeah.
That's based on a book by John Wyndham called The Midwich Cuckoos.
Well, now I'm gonna have to read the book. Oh my God. So I can
so research is a good thing. I mean, how many of you, when you're choosing a place name, go out and go, oh, where does this place name already appear?
I've done that. I did another.
Plan.
Yeah, I've done another short story set in a small town in Pennsylvania, in which I decided there needed to be a name, and there needed to be a name because of the it's important to the context of the story to have a name.
Mm-hmm.
But so what I did was I thought about small towns in Pennsylvania in the Northeast and looked for something that kind of sounded like it would be set there but didn't actually exist. And, so I just like kind of made up the name, put it in this, Google, and nothing came up. So I was like, all right, winner, here we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's good,
you can
though.
get away with. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Brian.
The ways you can get away with that is certain types of naming towns or villages or whatever, where you've got places like Pittsburgh and Harrisburg and thisville and that town and whatever. You can recombine elements until you find something that doesn't already exist, but it's going to sound perfectly plausible. That can be more difficult with other naming conventions, but for a lot of American towns in particular, it's actually pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think
so that's a good place to go, because one of the things that I find very, very useful for this, for the purposes of creating place names, is to create a morphology of place names, right? And in fact, Berg and Ville and all those things are actually exactly what I'm talking about when I say morphology. Yep. Morphology are basically minimal meaning pieces in language, and so suffixes and prefixes. Yeah, Brian's trying to get into the Hangout, so hopefully he can make it. But so those minimal meaning pieces can be very, very useful to you, and you can either try to use existing ones from our languages, or you can make up your own.
The risk is you say minimal meaning, but again, that's going to vary. They may have much less meaning in America, where people have just readopted names from other countries. You go up to New England and you've got Bristol and Gloucester and all these other places. Now, those places originally had meaning and context. Most place names originally derive from specific meanings, but America is a particularly odd culture because a lot of names have been repurposed and don't have any resemblance, in geographical or contextual terms to their original coining. But if you go to Europe, that tends not to be the case. There's most European place names are very specifically, geographical or historical in origin, in a way that Americans often aren't.
Yeah. I'm with you. I think it's a good point, and actually useful in context, because every time we run into an example from our world, I think it's useful to try to extrapolate it to another world. So, say that you have a really, really ancient culture, you're going to want to be looking at place names that have a meaningful connection with the geography of the area, right? Whereas, maybe you have another group that is a colonist group or a transplanted group, right? And then you may, in fact, find dissociation there, where, it's New York and knew this, knew that, or whatever. Or you've got things that are just sort of stuck onto their locations because they remind somebody of something, but they really don't have a historically grounded connection with the location. Yeah. Oh, and yes, and Reggie brings up the issue of Springfields. There are lots of Springfields in lots of states, and so choosing, it's that whole, the more times you hear it in more different contexts, the more generic it becomes, right? Because you can't necessarily place it with any very specific location. That's exactly what Springfield is doing for The Simpsons, is dissociating it from a specific context.
One thing that came to mind a minute ago when you were talking about suffixes and prefixes and burgs and villes, and you can give a sense of history, deep history.
Yes.
Because maybe your land was conquered by different waves of invaders.
Yep.
And they're going to have very different morphemes, I guess is the word.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of places in England you can identify sort of when and by whom they were named. Anything ending in ing or ham is Saxon. Anything ending in Thorpe or Thwaite is Danish or Norse, etc. So yes, there are very, very specific cues within that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I just want to make an observation about where I live, again, coming back to the small town Pennsylvania thing, and I'm sure this is true in other states where there are a lot of, very, still a lot of woodland area or wild area where you will have something like a street that has one house on it, right? And then so what you'll often find around here is the street name will actually be just the last name of the family that lives in that house, that's on the one house that's on that street.
Mm-hmm.
So then it splinters into this other thing about very particular small-scale personal significance sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I'm writing stuff down.
Okay. But I'm wondering if anyone else is seeing that. Obviously in a city, in a very heavily populated city, you're not going to see that sort of thing.
Well, I think actually you do. There's a sort of a sidebar conversation going on in the chat bar, and it's distracting me. So let's bring it out into the open, guys. Okay. we have a lot of examples coming out from the UK where there are these old words that are origins for them and whatever. And it's all good. I like you guys talking in the chat bar because it gives me ideas for where to go next. So let's go there. Basically, I think that people always apply names in a meaningful way, right? They just do it in a different mode, right? I mean, if a people has been living in a location for thousands of years, the place names will have that kind of deep-rooted association, right? But history overlays over itself over and over and over and over. And so what we're seeing when we look at America is not a lack of meaning, but we are in the midst of all the overlays, right? Because if you go back to
modern collage,
if you go back to the Native American cultures, then you're going to find these deeply culturally rooted place names, right?
A lot
that
of those,
is exactly
particularly
what you're
in
going to
England,
find.
where they were adopted.
And then they were borrowed in some cases, or just overwritten in other cases. But I think that overwriting in and of has a pattern in and of itself that can be meaningful. You know, whenever something gets renamed, that says something. Or when it doesn't get renamed, like so. So I'll give you an example. Soul's Bargain mentions the renaming of the city of Lakes Gate as Pelismara. Okay. Lakes Gate was what it was called because that was the practical, geographically grounded name for this town because it was kind of near the lake, right? And people travel from there to the lake, etc., etc. Right, fine. And then a woman named Pelisma saved the city. So they took her name, Pelisma, and they added R, because R is a morpheme that means of. And then they added A, because that is the morpheme that means place. And so it became Place of Pelisma, and now its name is Pelismara. Right? That's a historical event that gives people an inspiration to rename something in a particular way. Right? And then on the opposite side, there are, so for example, there's a place called the Plaza of Varan in my book, and it has buildings. One of the buildings there is the residence. It's always been the residence, but now it's the Eminence's residence, even though it hasn't always been the Eminence's residence. It's the residence, right? Okay, so that's depends on who lives there. Then there's a place that's called the Embati Academy. It's actually the Academy. It's always been the Academy. It hasn't always been the Embati Academy, but it's always been the Academy. Right? So these were, things have changed, but the core function of these buildings has not changed. Then there's a place called the Old Forum. And it's just bureaucratic offices right now. But it's called the Old Forum for a reason. And eventually, hopefully, somebody will ask me to write about, wait a minute, why is it called the Old Forum? Right? And I'll get a chance to explore what it used to be for. And that'll be really, really fun. But at the very least, I know that I'm putting in places that have old names that suggest that there is history behind what is currently there. So those are examples of renaming or keeping of old names or repurposing of old names. So overlaying is good. It happens. It suggests history.
Yes.
You don't. As with anything having to do with world building, uniformity is basically your enemy. You don't want uniformity because uniformity suggests perfect newness. And often unnaturalness.
Yeah, I think it's easy to do that as, like, Americans. I think we're less historically aware being a newer country.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't always just think about that because, like, chances are you live in, like, a subdivision that was built within the last 10 years and all the street names are just whatever theme they picked for that subdivision.
Right.
It's virtually meaningless, They just have, like, themes, like you'll come across a string of college-named streets or a string of just letters or numbers, where it's just
right.
stuff.
But you know what? So what? Yes, okay, we can say, okay, those don't have meaning or whatever, but they do in a sense because they indicate they indicate a trend in our construction and our conception of how places work, where it's like, okay, we're going to go to this area and whatever was there before, well, it's not there anymore, and we're going to go over it, and this will be our theme area, and it will be on a theme of trees or flowers. Because we knew a neighborhood once where every street name was named after a type of flower. And they were running out of ideas. One of the one of the streets was called Sand Blossom, and we were like, "What the heck is Sand Blossom?" Right?
I know that's not even a thing. Oh my god.
Yeah. So Brian asked, one of the Brians asked, what I think of uniformity in certain regions, and uniformity always means something. Right? It means that there has been a sweeping change all at once where somebody made a decision about uniformity.
Yeah, there's been a monocultural imposition, if you will.
Yeah. And unless that's what you want, okay, great. But even if it is what you want, likely, if there were old names there previously, those are going to stick around, at very least in the vernacular, and what people refer to the places as. If there's any way for them to, keep their identification of those locations, right? So, an old street, unless it's been completely raised and the entire area redone so that you can't recognize the street, some people are going to recognize it as the old street and still refer to it like that.
Yeah.
Yes, and if anybody is actually interested in looking into place names that have strangely inappropriate words in them, there are examples that go floating around on Facebook every so often, and I have seen some of these, and I'm going, wow, I wouldn't want to live there just so I didn't have to write my address down.
Right.
I knew somebody who lived. I swear this is true. Who lived in a house called Sloppy Bottom Cottage.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't want that. I don't want my mail coming to that. I don't want everyone writing that down. But that's absolutely true. That was the name of the house. So yeah, you get the strangest things, and I'm sure it was named for good non-bowel related reasons, but it's still unfortunate.
Well, we may have had a lot of plumbing problems.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I suspect it was somewhere that was prone to flooding, marshy ground, whatever. And it was
exactly. A hollow.
How you kind of identify which cottage you're talking about. Oh, that's the one down at the bottom where it's always sloppy and soggy and whatever. It's just but
yeah.
But it happens in modern times as well. And I don't know if this ever got through, but there's certainly, because I haven't found a reference to it specifically currently existing. But in York, when they were building new housing estates, these days they build new housing estates. Again, like you said, they've got to come up with a bunch of names, and there's themes are often used, like flowers or whatever. In York, they wanted to come up with a whole set of streets named after historical figures. People who are famous, around York. That sounds broadly reasonable until you decide you're living on Eric Bloodaxe Avenue, which kind of just,
Oh my God, I would totally live there.
I know. You're going to get a certain class of people living on Eric Bloodaxe Avenue, and then another bunch of people who are going like, I am not moving to Eric Bloodaxe Avenue. Thank you very much.
I guess it depends on who your famous people are.
Indeed, yes. I mean, somebody who's famous as a monster across much of Europe, the name Attila the Hun is synonymous with, pillage and plunder and whatever. Attila is still one of the most popular names for children in Hungary.
Yeah. Okay, so actually, I'm gonna steer us sideways a little bit, back to the morphology question, because I know I've been speaking against uniformity, but I'm going to talk about linguistic pattern uniformity in a sense. This is something where if you have chosen a language, especially if it's a conlang that is spoken throughout a region, the place names are going to follow a particular pattern that you're not necessarily going to want to break, so long as that language has been around in that area for a long enough period of time. I had two towns, right? Pelesmara was named Pelesmara, and then I had another one that was named Darren Vale, where I made up Darren, and then I took Vale as though it were like a valley, right? Mm-hmm. And I left that alone for a really long time, but it just bugged me and bugged me and bugged me, and I was like, you know what? If you're going to have Solimna and you're going to have Pelesmara, right? I was okay with the city of Peak because it was like, okay, that's in translation. It's very clearly in translation. Mm-hmm. But the combination of like half the word being language and the other half being English started really bothering me after a while, and I renamed Darrenville so that at least it would be, actually, I mean, I called it Darrenville, so I'll write it in the chat bar. But now at least it's a name that's completely in another language. Yeah. And I don't think Vel is, I don't intend for Vel to mean valley. Right? I'm going to roughly keep the sounds the same because I like it, but forget about that,
Well, and in your case with the Varen world, it's got to match the world history too, right?
Absolutely,
like,
yeah.
Because again, the place names have meaning.
Yeah. So I guess that's not so much a problem of uniformity, but it's a problem of consistency.
Yeah.
In my own work, I do have a tendency to wedge my names in later. When it comes to place, if something doesn't hit me like immediately in first draft, I'll be like parenthetical, side note, placeholder name, and then I'll come back, look for the certain meaning. Does anyone else do that? Do you find that it interferes with flow?
No, I do that all the time. I had in T times 3, there was a fictional town next door to my fictional town that I needed to refer to a lot. And I don't think it was until the 7th draft or something that I finally just got out a map of Maine and started looking for possibilities. And I ended up naming it after a lake, Musquatch. So that just became the next town over. And I'm like, okay, fine. I just, I don't, whatever at that point. Literally through all the drafts, it was just next town over. In big capital letters. So
So would you guys like to segue into geography a bit at this point? How do you go about looking at your geography for worlds that you? I mean, shoot. When it comes to real world geography, I figure you just go do some research.
Yeah.
And what lives here, and what kind of biomes do we have, and what's the climate like, and what resources does that give us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think in a fictional world, I mean, Juliet, I've talked to you about Spectre's End, which is it's set on Earth, but like several hundred years into the future, and there's been climate change and disaster, but the point I'm getting to in a very long-winded way, I think a lot of when you're building your geography for a world, I don't know, I think for me it's like part of it, I think at least I'm motivated in making choices about that based on what kind of challenges I want my characters to face. So then, it can create a different sense of danger and tension that you wouldn't get from another element in the story, maybe.
So, yeah, well, it's... Exactly. You don't want to have just again, this problem of uniformity. You don't want to have just sort of like, well, random planes where we can just trot around and do whatever. But at the same time...
Edge of the map syndrome. It's like, oh, the map ends here, so either there's a sea that just goes on forever, or there's a set of plains and that nobody lives in, or...
Well, yeah, it's funny because, like...
People always live in nice rectangular areas of the world so they fit on a map page.
Well, when we talked about maps with Christian Steele, he was talking about how a lot of times the countries that you see in fictional worlds are strangely 8.5 by 11. Just because that's the size of paper that we have, and that goes back to sheep, and wow. So sheep have a lot to do with the geography of Westeros, for example, strangely. However...
8 by 11 is for wimps.
Yeah, maps are great. But I do think it's worth having a planetary awareness. So that you're not creating a planet with one biome.
Oh, yes. Star Wars syndrome. The ice planet, the desert planet, the jungle planet. Stop it
Oh my
now.
God.
Look at that. And also, like, you can have people who are not aware of the extent of their planet. I mean, the Varni are not aware of the extent of their planet. They just aren't. But at the same time, I think it's important for the author to be aware of the extent of the planet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and also, there are some kinds of juxtapositions of climate and climate regions and geographical features that don't make sense. So you can't just completely like, oh, I'm just going to make some stuff up because it'd be nice to have some mountains here or whatever. I mean, it's nice to kind of think about tectonic plates and, oh, gee, if there's a mountain here in the middle of nowhere, where did it come from? Well, geological hotspot kind of thing. And is there a trail of mountains here? Do we have tectonic plate movement that would cause, a string of islands or a string of mountains out in the middle of nowhere? Or, is there a reason why this happened? Those things are kind of important. I mean, I suppose that not everyone is looking out for them to the same degree.
But some people will be.
But some people are going to go, what?
Yes. Yeah, what do you mean an ice planet?
Prevailing winds so that one side of the mountain is wet and the other side of the mountain is dry. Or more like a mountain range, but...
Yeah.
Know which side of the mountain is going to be dry.
Yes, and why?
Well, rotation of the Earth. First decide which way your planet rotates, frankly. That will make a huge, huge impact on the weather systems of the planet. They don't all go in one direction. Stuff does loop back, like the trade winds and so forth. But broadly speaking, as soon as you know which way round your planet goes, that's going to make a huge difference as to which bits are going to be dry.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's always fun setting things on planets where they do rotate the other way, or even the heresy that I never see anyone indulge in is will you please set something in the southern hemisphere of a planet one of these days? Because I am really bored with the north being cold and the south being hot deserts and everything in between. It's like, no, I'm sorry. There's a southern hemisphere on other planets too, you know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Or maybe like a different set of extreme conditions and environment that vary across one planet that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as Earth-based.
Mm.
Mm.
Yep, it's funny. It's funny that northern and southern hemisphere thing.
It's even more prevalent than the good guys live in the west and the bad guys live in the east. Everything is so northern hemisphere centric. It is scarily so.
Yeah,
Like, I know our planet has more of its land in the north than the south. That's not a universal given, you know. It's not like it's floating up to the north because that's at the top of the map.
right.
Exactly.
You know, that's interesting, though. I wonder if we just have a tendency... So it's like, because so many things, like, are, like, head... Like, our head is where, like, all of our really important senses are, right? So we associate up with north, and down is with our feet, and your feet are pretty important, too. They don't have all the central stuff. I'm just kind of, like, free associating here with why that might be a trend.
I mean, that's
North was standardized as the top of maps during the Renaissance, but before that, if you look at earlier maps, you'll find north is often at the south. At the bottom of the map.
Really?
There's a I could have maps to prove that. Hold on.
You are like the best. This is great.
Well, how would you specifically...
That's why I came and signed on for this one. Let's see if I've got the Fromaro map here.
I mean, how would you specifically get across in a story that it is in the southern hemisphere? I mean...
Well, wouldn't you just say it at some point?
At some point, you refer to those hideous, frigid, cold regions as being to the south instead of to the north. That's the simplest way of getting away with it.
Yep.
Oh. I also have large books.
Ooh.
You want maps? I have maps. 14.9. Where are we? No, it's going to be. This is one of my favorite books, and I'm trying to find Framaro's map in it, and I can't find it. Maybe I only got it online. There are early maps. 1482. This is, I know, one of the earliest ones to show the Europe as we know it. I don't know if this is going to come out, but this is. There's the Mediterranean Sea at the bottom, and Europe and Asia sitting above it. But prior to that, maps were written and drawn up in all sorts of interesting ways. There was no standard. So it was during the Renaissance that happened. And even then, they didn't do it all the time. There's some intriguing early map projections. There's a map here. Oh, again, I don't know how well this will come out. This is from 1531, and it's done so that there is the northern hemisphere done from the North Pole, and there is the southern hemisphere with a completely made-up Antarctica that's actually not too far off from the real thing, which is interesting for 1531. People were drawing up maps, and they were still learning, about how to do more and more detailed maps and how to adopt standards.
Yeah.
And it was only during that era that, north became the standard thing as a type of map.
And I think there was actually also, I mean, this is not quite the same as the geography question, but I think right around that same time you had clocks that went either direction, and at a certain point clocks became standardized so that clockwise now means one thing. But it wasn't always the case.
That's interesting. I must admit, although I know a fair amount about medieval clocks, I do not remember anything about the decision on when they rotated clockwise. I do know that they had all sorts of different localized time variations. They mostly used 24 hours, but when they struck, some struck 1 till 24, some struck 1 till 12 twice. For some, the 12 hours that started at dawn ended at dusk, and then you had another 12 hours at night, and you had to keep adjusting the clocks because the length of the day and night changed, and you had to speed up or slow down the clocks to try and space those 12 hours into... That really happened.
Yeah, I believe you, but it sounds quite...
I've heard that one too.
I have a planned trilogy of novels that basically revolves around a character who is a Renaissance clockwork geek, so who goes around inventing clockwork ways of doing things.
That'll be great to see.
So there's not enough clockwork and camera geeks and stuff. I'm teaching a Renaissance course at the moment here in Silver City, and during the research I came across a guy who he used Roger Bacon's camera obscura plans, but he stuck a lens in it. This is the first time that anyone had actually stuck a projecting lens in a camera obscura. So basically he invented the camera in 1527, and the guy was only in his teens.
Wow.
That's so cool.
I know, it's awesome. The Renaissance is fantastic. Everyone should have a Renaissance. Even though the Renaissance never actually happened. But everyone should have a Renaissance. All this stuff about medieval fantasy bores the crap out of me, and I'm like, no, I want more Renaissance fantasy, and there isn't enough of it out there. All
right, so we'll put our watchers onto that task. You guys, go write about the Renaissance. So we're at 10 minutes to 12, and we started relatively on time this time. So I'm feeling like we've covered a bunch of things. Do we want to do more about geography, or are we wrapping up?
It depends if you do want to talk literally about world building. I mean, how you do go about, and this is probably more for science fiction where you're dealing with multiple worlds, and you're actually talking about whole solar systems, whole galaxies. To what extent do you want to consider geography? It's like, again, we have a very particular view of astronomy and the night sky and stuff because of where we live in a quiet corner of the galaxy that doesn't actually have a lot of stuff around it. Imagine what the night sky would be like to people who lived on a star system in a globular cluster or near the center of the galaxy. It's a completely different concept.
Yeah.
There's some fantastic pictures somewhere imagined by people if they were on a planet orbiting a star that was in one of the Magellanic Clouds, of how the Milky Way galaxy would rise up at night over their horizon, occupying about a third of the sky. I mean, that sort of sight would just be, I mean, what sort of religion and myth and so forth would you start associating with that as your civilization grew? That would just be awesome. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of a little extension of geography. So,
Yes, I can hear you on that one.
Galactic geography.
There it is.
But even that would be a great detail in a secondary world without going into the astronomical reasons of why it was that way.
Yeah, to talk about the great sky wheel or something that just comes up every night, that would just be cool.
Yeah, that would be cool.
People, you're right, you don't see that a lot. Like, if you were, like, big, colorful clouds, like if your night sky looked like a Hubble photograph.
Yeah. And there's no reason why in certain places it wouldn't do that. So it would be awesomely cool.
I'm trying to think of the name of this book I saw that had the stars were really, really, really bright. And I was like, Well, that's kind of cool because I've never seen that before, but I can't remember the name of the book.
If you were in a globular cluster or something like that, you'd have a lot of close stars. Most of them tend to be pretty even in their brightness. So the closer they are, the brighter they'll look. But they're much more even than the stars around our neck of the woods, which do vary hugely from the massive blue-white giants to tiny little dwarves and whatever. So yes, to have this, a much more even distribution over the sky and a much brighter set of stars, again, would just be very, very different. Would you pick out patterns in the same way that we do?
Yeah.
Our constellations, our asterisms, are our own social cultural constructs. They don't really exist. There are some commonalities, but even then, I mean, the sky looks different depending where you are on the planet. There's lots of stuff in ancient civilizations up in the northern hemisphere where you've got all these stuff about sightlines with equinoxes and solstices and the rising of the northern extent of the sun and so forth. They don't have the same kind of things in when you're living on the equator because that doesn't happen. The whole idea of the sky rotating around a north star or a southern point or whatever doesn't happen at the equator. Everything is a big arch. So you see it very differently in context. It's not like there's no concept of an axis when you don't see a point of that rotation. When all you see is everything just comes up one side and down the other, the sky looks conceptually quite different. It doesn't look like a sphere.
Yeah.
That's really, I'm trying to imagine all of this, and it's very difficult to switch your point of reference in that.
And that's the trouble. It is, and a lot of people don't even realize that the point of references that they've got are, determined by so many, cultural, historical, geographical, limitations like that. I didn't realize that about the equatorial sky until I was reading stuff up about the Inca and their early astronomical observations and so forth. And they're clearly thinking of the sky in a different way than I'm used to growing up with, the pyramids and Stonehenge and all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
She's making approving noises. I don't know if you can hear her.
You can barely hear anything over Igor back there. God.
Oh no! Is that? Oh yeah.
The birds have their contributions to make to our discussion about geography.
They do.
This is the first hangout I've been in where it's been all birds, not cats.
Yeah, my cats
Just,
are.
well, my cats aren't here. Otherwise, they'd be looking at the screen, going, "I want that bird."
Yeah, my cat would be over here standing on me, twitching.
Yep.
But instead, he's over tucked between the curtains and the window.
Maybe he's afraid of her.
I think we're going to wrap this up at this point. Thank you for bringing in that last point because that was really wonderful and fascinating, and I'm not even sure if it's geography, but it's enough for geography that I'm ready to write it up. So, Brian, since you were not here at the beginning, we have a special guest next week. This is also a reminder for anybody who might be watching the video. Jen Brissett is going to be coming, and I'm hoping I'm saying her last name correctly, to talk about world building in her book that's coming out, very exciting, coming out very soon, called Elysium, and it should be really neat. So, oh, there's a cat.
Yay! All is well with the internet. It's got a cat on it.
However, we did have a further topic that we had proposed last time, which was basically a research topic: how and when to research cultures for world building and how to apply things to your work. So we'll do that the week after. So instead of the 9th, it should be the 16th. Will be the research topic.
I'm not going to be here. I just realized.
What?
I'm going to Conjecture in San Diego.
Oh.
I will not be here, yeah.
I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Well, Let's talk next week about whether we should postpone it and do something else in between so that you can attend. But depends on how important it is for you, Jay, honestly.
No, it's okay. It's just whatever. I'll be back when I'm back from conjecture.
And
I'm going down on Thursday. I'm taking the train, so.
Okay, so I'm gonna say we're done with our video portion, and I'm gonna stop broadcast, and then you can tell me about your trip. All right. Thanks to everybody who's watching, and thanks you guys for a great discussion.